We're going to turn next to studying the nervous systems, which is the architecture of our neural anatomy and neurophysiology. It's best described as the body having nervous systems. We actually have several, which are divided up into a hierarchy. We have a nervous system, which is composed of the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, which is everything outside the brain and the spinal cord, which includes the somatic nervous system, which is how we interact with our environment. This includes our senses and our motor coordination. The other peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, which is concerned with regulation of the body's environment and essentially maintaining the body's internal environment. Part of the autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous systems, which are involved in either maintaining our resting state, just like we would normally be, or arousing a fight or flight response. And we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. To give you an idea in a little bit more detail of how this works, the brain and the spinal cord is the central nervous system, or the CNS. Our brain, of course, interprets and stores information, sends orders to muscles, glands, and organs, sort of coordinates the whole process. Our spinal cord is the pathway that connects the brain to all of our peripheral nervous systems. So that peripheral nervous system, once we leave the spinal cord, transmits information to and from the central nervous system. The somatic nervous system carries sensory information and controls movement of the skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system automatically regulates glands, internal organs, blood vessels, pupil dilation, digestion, and blood pressure. And of course, there are sensory nerves that take information from the autonomic nervous system to tell us when we're hungry, when we're full, when we're in pain, regulates our heartbeat, etc., etc. Now, this is divided then into the parasympathetic division, which maintains body functions under ordinary conditions and saves energy, and the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares the body to react and expend energy in times of stress. And this is going to become important for us in this particular class because the sympathetic nervous system can be activated by certain drugs. So we have the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. Of course, we have the somatic nervous system, which interacts with the environment, conducts sensor information from receptors, and then to the skeletal muscle system. Our autonomic nervous system is the division of the peripheral nervous system that participates in the regulation of the body's internal environment. The sympathetic is the division that mobilizes energy and resources during stressful situations, e.g. flight or flight responses, and the parasympathetic nervous system calms the body and conserves energy during non-stressful times. So most of the time we're functioning in the parasympathetic system. The sympathetic nervous system will kick in during periods of high stress. We've all had this happen. Cars stop suddenly in front of you while you're driving on the road, and your heart races, and you feel edgy right afterwards. That's because that sympathetic nervous system is kicked in all of a sudden. And again, we'll talk more about some of the physiological consequences of that here in a moment. So, to give you a little bit more graphic detail about these, when the parasympathetic nervous system is functioning, our pupils are constricted, or at least depending on how much light there is, generally constricted. The bronchi are constricted. Our heartbeat is slow. Our digestive system is functioning normally. Our blood vessels are dilated, so blood's flowing everywhere it's supposed to be. When the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, our pupils dilate, and the reason for that is so we can gather as much light as possible, gather as much information as possible. The bronchi in the lungs will relax, so that we can process more oxygen and exchange oxygen more efficiently between blood and the environment. Our heartbeat will accelerate and become stronger. Again, the whole purpose of this system is to give us extra resources in a stressful situation. The sympathetic nervous system will inhibit activity in the digestive tract. So we won't feel hungry. In fact, we won't generally eat under those circumstances. And then the blood vessels of all of our internal organs will constrict. Now, that's what happens in a fight or flight situation. So we have all of the energy we can to run, fight, whatever it is that we're going to need, we have all that extra energy to do so, which is why people can do extraordinary physical feats during these time periods. Part of this will also allow us to allow extra muscles to be activated that wouldn't be activated otherwise. Now, drugs like amphetamines will actually engage the sympathetic nervous system response. In fact, you can usually tell someone who is used amphetamine because their pupils are fairly dilated. In fact, the primary ingredient of methamphetamine is a bronchodilator, which is ephedrine. Ephedrine was initially used as an asthma drug, and so you can see how these things sort of relate to one another. Amphetamines, of course, will cause an accelerated and strengthened heartbeat, very little stomach activity. People who use amphetamines don't eat very much, if at all, and constriction of internal organ blood vessels. So the problem with long-term use of those drugs is they take away blood supply from internal organs, and those internal organs shut down. This is one of the reasons why methamphetamine users have such bad skin, problems with their teeth, because the blood has been taken away from those organs, and of course they're not eating, and then if they're smoking meth, it's a toxic environment, all sorts of things that are bad for them. In addition, there are some other issues along with amphetamines. People who are on amphetamines tend to be highly sexually aroused, but because the internal organ blood vessels have been constricted, they don't function very well. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And we'll talk more about that when we get to amphetamines. So again, that was the autonomic nervous systems we just talked about. Of course, it's all constructed from neurons and nerves, which we've already talked about. We, of course, have sensory neurons, which carry incoming information from sensory receptors to the central nervous system. These can come from all of our senses plus internal senses. That's how we know, for example, if there's a problem inside because there's pain, or that's how we know we're hungry, etc. Motor neurons, of course, carry outgoing information from the central nervous system to muscles and glands and to organs. Finally, there are actually interneurons, and these are within the central nervous system, and they internally communicate within the central nervous system and actually intervene between motor and sensory neurons. And these are really important for protecting the body from harm. In fact, this is what they do, is they're involved in reflexes, which we'll look at here in a moment. So the spinal cord plays an important role in the central nervous system and interacting, of course, with our peripheral nervous system. It's essentially an information superhighway. All sensory and motor information is relayed via the spinal cord, protects the body via reflexes. And these occur when sensory and motor information are connected by those interneurons I was just talking about in the spinal cord. So a reflex will actually occur before the brain even knows that anything has happened. And this is what happens. If we have a skin receptor, which is of course going to have a pain receptor in it, which feels that there is something hot, that sensory information will travel up to the spinal cord. What happens then is, before that information travels up to the brain, an interneuron will get involved and initiate a motor response so that you move a muscle away from the pain-inducing response before your brain can get involved. Now, of course, your brain can override that. You've seen people do this party trick all the time where they hold their fingers over a flame or do stupid things like run across hot coals. But that basic reflex action doesn't involve the brain at all. And that's an important part of protecting the body from harm. The last nervous system I want to talk about is actually the endocrine system. And we refer to this as the slow information system. It's a nervous system because it certainly is involved in the regulation of the body and lots of behaviors we're going to talk about. But it's slow because rather than being affected by neurotransmission, hormones are released into the bloodstream, which then travel through blood to get out to other places. And so it takes a lot longer for that to happen than for an action potential to be generated. So the endocrine system functions through the use of hormones. And hormones When they're out in the body, are hormones. When in the brain, they often are neurotransmitters. And so one person's hormone is another person's neurotransmitter, depending on where they're studying it. So hormones are chemicals released by glands of the endocrine system, which travel through the blood and influence both the body and brain. The adrenal glands are an important part of the endocrine system. They're located on top of our kidneys, and this is where most of our stress hormones come from, including epinephrine and norepinephrine, and a variety of other adrenal hormones such as dehydroepiandrosterone, which we'll talk about later. It's DHEA. It's an important adrenal product. Important part of the endocrine system is the pituitary gland, which is located at the base of the brain, which is controlled by the hypothalamus, which is the master of the endocrine system. The pituitary gland controls our growth and influences the release of hormones from other glands. And the pituitary gland actually works on a feedback system. And the example I'm going to talk about is testosterone release in males. So here's a quick overview of the endocrine system. Lots of parts of the body are involved: the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the thymus, adrenal glands, the pancreas, and ovaries in females, and the testes in males. All of these comprise the endocrine system. Pancreas is involved in a variety of hormones involved in eating. Individuals with diabetes have oftentimes problems with the pancreas. That's where the hormones like insulin are produced. So we'll talk about some individual hormones as we move along. So as I was talking a moment ago, the testosterone cycle is regulated by the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And the hypothalamus will release what's called luteinizing hormone. This will travel then in males down to the testes, which will then cause the testes to release testosterone. That testosterone then travels back to the hypothalamus, which causes it to stop releasing luteinizing hormone. Because the hypothalamus has stopped releasing luteinizing hormone, the testes stop producing testosterone. Because the testosterone stops reaching the hypothalamus, it releases more luteinizing hormone, which causes more testosterone. So it works on a feedback loop. Essentially, this is just like the thermostat in your house. It gets too hot, air conditioning comes on, air conditioning reaches the thermostat shuts off, it gets too warm, thermostat comes back on. It's a feedback loop. This is one of the reasons why testosterone fluctuates a great deal for males, particularly younger males, because it's dramatically peaking and dropping over about a 90-minute cycle. Now, of course, women function on a much different cycle, and we will talk about that later on in the semester. So the sex organs are, of course, an important part of the endocrine system, which include the testes and the ovaries. They produce testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. Males and females have most of these hormones, just in different levels. Males, of course, have much more testosterone. Women have much higher levels of estrogen and progesterone. These levels are higher and lower depending on where they are, where women are across the menstrual cycle, which is an important part of understanding how hormones affect cognition. And we refer to these often as steroid hormones. And we're actually going to talk about steroids and how they affect behavior much later in the term. All of these influence growth, development of our sex characteristics, can influence behavior like aggression, sex drive, and memory. And we'll talk about some other characteristics that might be involved in exposure to androgens as well. It's an important part of understanding behavior. And we'll talk a great deal about that later in the semester. All right, well, that is our introduction to the nervous system.